Good luck.
I'm sorry, I should not laugh at my audience. Uh, Assuming we have an audience, because we are going live right now with a slightly different process. And, according to this, we have, wow, okay. A good deal. Anyway, we're going live. It is the third Sunday of the month, and the third Sunday of the month means that we have the one, the only live, not live from, but straight from GalaxyCon, Cliff Winnig, who has brought with him two great guests. Now that was interesting. I know you couldn't see it, Hilton, but your jug disappeared when you tilted it up to drink. So all of a sudden you are tilting up an invisible object.
Yeah.
It disappears against the background. I loved it.
I have superpowers.
Superpowers, that is it. And don't laugh, when you moved right there, it made it look like you had flapping wings. Okay, we're going to dedicate this show, to the impact of virtual background on Hilton. So, thank you guys all for coming. And Thaddeus, I saw you made a beautiful intro to the show, and thank you. And at this point, I'm going to go monitor the world to see how things are going, and welcome our guests in here, the people who have come on to watch this. And I am going to get your book up here, Thaddeus. So I encourage you, Cliff, now to start taking care of your guests so I can stop talking. And
I'm just waiting for you to stop talking, Bob, so I can start taking
Well,
care of my guests.
talking is something I do. Did you know that we have a lot of preachers in my family? It is something
I am not surprised.
seeing faces makes us talk. Okay. Bye.
Good night, Bob.
Bye-bye. A likely story. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Third Sunday. I've got a couple of wonderful guests here. Returning guest Thaddeus Howze is the author of Hayward's Reach.
Hey, I know that book.
Yeah, and the novella Broken Glass, as well as The Answer Man, because he's really knowledgeable about a wide range of subjects, and he's very good at research. So between those two things, he becomes the answer man and answers questions diligently and in an organized and detailed way online for people. It's Quora, right, that you answer questions?
I primarily answered questions on Quora. However, my identity has followed me to other places. So
Yeah.
people still send me weird superhero questions, and I don't mind because, that's kind of what I did, and it's a trademark. But I get a lot of other questions now, like for writing. I write a thing called Writing Craft, where they ask me questions about how to be a better writer. And so I've been, over the years, collating those things. So eventually I'm going to put those into a book. My wife is probably going to make me do it soon because I have probably 48, 50 essays, and they're all about
a great idea.
Writing. So
I think that'd be a great idea. I think you got a lot. You said a lot of cool things over the years. Thaddeus is also sometimes Superman, at least judging by his attire sometimes. So between that and his great knowledge of superheroes, I asked him to come on today. We'll talk about the subject in a minute. Hilton Collins, first-time guest. He is an artist in training. He's working on his skill. He's a comic book, also has a deep knowledge of comic books. And he is the creator of the Super Nerd video series on YouTube, and where he analyzes movies and other media. And so I asked these two fine gentlemen on today because I decided the subject for this week is illustration in storytelling, and by which I mean one of two things. One, comics and graphic novels, which is a medium as we're all familiar with, drawings with dialogue and text, but also books that have illustrations. Like as we all, as readers, started off, as kids, being read to Dr. Seuss and other picture books. That's the actual publishing category is picture books. And then as we got older and learned to read, we got into what are called chapter books, which are also illustrated for small children. And then it goes middle grade, young adult, although there's now a new adult category. I still don't believe in it. But the idea is all our early experience with literature is illustrated, and oftentimes literature for adults was illustrated. Like currently I'm reading my older kids this Lord of the Rings edition, illustrated by the author. So it's got J.R.R. Tolkien's pen and ink drawings and his watercolors illustrating. And he wasn't, the best artist in the world, but he was illustrating his world, right? Mm-hmm. So this edition, when I was a kid and I first discovered The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings through something called the Tolkien Calendar, which was art about Tolkien that came out every year at that time by the brothers Hildebrandt, which I'm sure Thaddeus remembers. Mm-hmm. And these guys had their own vision of Middle Earth that was amazing. And you couldn't really buy a brothers Hildebrandt illustrated edition of the book, but you could buy the calendar every year and get 12 pictures of what they thought of as Middle Earth. And it was highly influential. Another Tolkien artist, Alan Lee, had a lot to do with the Peter Jackson look of the Middle Earth in those movies. And so I think that's supposed to be Thaddeus's book. I'm not sure. Anyway, I don't know why the illustration isn't coming, but click on the QR code and see what happens. Anyway, so I thought the interesting thing about, and there's some random books have been illustrated. Like there's this Poul Anderson book about an sea civilization that had like an illustration every 5 pages or so. There was a Roger Zelazny book that was illustrated like every few pages. There'd just be a black and white picture. That happens. Some of the Edgar Rice Burroughs, a lot of books were illustrated back early on. And then there was this idea that we all got that, well, that's kids stuff, pictures and books. So you should read, books should be boring and not have pictures. Like, the reader, there is a condition called aphantasia where people don't visualize in the theater of the mind, and that affects a certain percentage of the population. But for the majority of the population, people have like movies running in their heads when they read, especially fiction or narrative, nonfiction about events. And so there was this idea that's better, than illustration. But I think illustrations in the comic book medium, because I'll say that as a kid, some of my best novel experiences were classic comics editions, like the classic comics War of the Worlds and First Men in the Moon, which was just great stuff. Thaddeus remembers that. I don't think you remember that, Hilton, but it was a thing.
War of the Worlds, you said? Could you repeat that?
Yeah, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. First Men in the Moon by Jules Verne was another great classic comic. 52 pages, no ads.
I don't think I've read either of those as comics, but I'm definitely familiar with War of the Worlds.
Sure.
That's a legendary, iconic story. And
I read the book later, but I started it with like this illustrated edition, and so and I have a copy of it's in the other room. I have a copy of the novel illustrated by Tom Kidd. And he not only did the cover art, but he does illustrations in the book. And so that tradition is still happening. And so I was thinking about it and thinking that, at least as far as my thinking goes, that illustrations in a book or in a comic both enhance and channel the reader's imagination, right? When there's a comic, you picture especially comic book art, as you know, because you're studying it from the inside now, Hilton, is like the dynamic drawing, which tries to evoke motion uses various techniques to invoke motion or stillness, depending on the panel, right? And also in illustrations, the idea is to evoke the scene, to help the reader imagine the scene. And the reader, in either case, will imagine they're just keyframes, right? So-called keyframes in like animation. So animation, every once in a while, you get the whole thing as opposed to just the changes.
Sequential art.
And so the idea is that the imagination fills in, but the pictures enhance and channel. And ideally, a good illustration, they help elevate the story in some way. I'll give one more example, and then I'm going to let, I promise, my guests talk, is The Hunting of the Snark, An Agony in 8 Fits by Lewis Carroll. That is a weird, long narrative poem about the hunting of a creature called a snark. And there were originally, for the first published edition, a bunch of illustrations that were produced with a singular artist, and they published all but one of them. And one of the things about the snark is it's never described. And there was one illustration which was a picture of the snark, and it filled the whole. And they decided, no, we're not going to publish that one. We're going to let the reader decide what a snark looks like. And they publish, and I've seen that. I have like the annotated snark that has that as a kind of appendix. But the edition I first read, which was the original illustrations, has all these other illustrations: the baker, the banker, the bellman. There's a scene where the barrister dreams of the snark in a robe and wig in a courtroom, and you see him from behind, but all you see is the robe and the wig, right? So that the reader can imagine what the snark looks like without that being channeled, but everything else is in this stylized, illustrated quality that really does sort of enhance and elevate the story. But I thought it was interesting that they decided, yes, we'll have illustrations, but no, you're not going to see the snark.
There's a wisdom in that. The whole point, I believe, is ultimately to let you remember that the snark is anybody. It is everybody. It could be even you if you're not paying attention.
And don't be a boojum. All right. So having presented this thesis that I had in my head to my guests and my audience, I like this. Someone mentioned, Liam mentioned that Stephen King's The Stand was re-released with illustrations. Also, what I loved about the Dark Tower series was every one of the 7 books in the original was illustrated by a different artist. And it was like an artist, Stephen King collaborated. Michael Whalen did book 1 and 7. But then I got like book 1 came out and then book 2 came out, and it was a completely different artist, and the protagonist, Roland, looked totally different. And then book 3, again, and I just loved that. It was like recasting the characters every novel with different actors. But it was also that artist's vision of what was happening. And it was a really, really neat series. I think the current editions don't have the illustrations, which is a shame because they're wonderful. There's some full color plates, some black and white, chapter title illustrations. But anyway, gentlemen, please talk about illustration and storytelling and what you think of that and how you, as a reader and as a creator, when you make a decision, especially Thaddeus, because you're a writer, when you make a decision to write something, do you think, I want this to be a graphic novel, I want this to be a story, whatever?
So I'm a comic guy. I've been reading comics now for 50, let's go and just say 50 something years.
That's why you're here.
I've been reading comics a very long time. And though I've had many times where comics and I have fell out because of culture or politics or I hate to even say it, racism, I almost always come back to comics because there's a part of the narrative storytelling engine that has always appealed to me in comics. And one of the things I attribute my own imagination to is the fact that I read comics where books force you to do all the heavy lifting. And there's nothing wrong with this. Heavy lifting is good, makes our mind strong. What I liked about comics was it gave me a landscape that I could look at, that I could be involved in, I could be visually kept enthralled by. And then there are certain conceits with comics because of the way we tell stories in comics that we don't tell in any other format that made comics more accessible. Didn't matter how old you were, because even if you couldn't get the story from the writing, you very often could get it from the pictures themselves if the artist was good. And it added a layer of depth and emotion and connection that you can't get when you're just reading, because you're having to provide context yourself as a reader. So when you're young, as a child, when an adult is having an emotion, you might not be able to recognize it in the story because you don't recognize how that works in the story. But in a comic, if a character's having an emotion, you get to see it. So even if you don't quite understand the story, you can understand the emotion. And comics carried a context layer that you didn't get from books until you get older, because as a child, you have to provide that layer of context. And as a child, you don't have it. That's the challenge, is because you don't have it, you have to hope that the writer is good enough to layer it into your work. But with comics, you can get that. And that's a powerful tool, especially trying to appeal to young people when you're trying to connect to them. So I think it's a great vehicle. You're up, Hilton.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I like to read both, novels and prose and comics. The way you talked about it, Thaddeus, you kind of gave like a one versus the other kind of comparison, whereas comics, because they're so visual, they can show a lot of emotions that aren't on the page necessarily if it's just prose. I can see where you're coming from. I don't always really see that way, though, because I know when I read prose novels or short stories, I guess my mind does a lot of the work visually. I feel like I can kind of capture and picture a lot of stuff just fine and vividly like immerse myself in it, even though there aren't pictures. But that's very interesting. I was thinking, about visual versus prose. I mean, I'll take it either way, but I never really thought of one versus the other like that. I know that when I first got into comics when I was a little kid, I know my cousins got me introduced. They were huge. They're older than me, about 15 years older, whatever, older cousins, and they were huge like Marvel X-Men fans, and they introduced me to a lot of X-Men, and I think Uncanny X-Men and Alpha Flight, and that kind of got me hooked into comics, and from then on I've continued the hobby. But it's interesting that, Thaddeus, you talked about how comic books visually can convey such emotion that isn't obviously readily apparent when it's just prose. That made me think of those X-Men comics. Those X-Men comics were very dramatic, very emo. They were like so.
The X-Men were so emo. Oh my gosh,
were.
I've never heard of it described that way, but that's all.
Especially after Claremont took over.
Yeah.
After Claremont.
They were soap operas with superpowers, and that actually, I think, is one of the elements that made a lot of the classic Marvel comics so successful. Like the old Avengers comics could be emo. Spider-Man was emo. Peter Parker. He was going through all this stuff with Mary Jane and Gwen and his friends and villains. That was very emotional. I do think like soap operas, sci-fi action soap operas, I think were a big key to Marvel's success. And that kind of in the old days. And I think that spilled over to general, because it like beyond Marvel, because looking back, some of the older DC comics I read, they could get pretty emo too. Although I didn't get into DC until after I started reading old Marvel. So I don't know if maybe classic DC was like that too. I just didn't read it back then. But I do know a lot of the old, like New Teen Titans with Marv Wolfman. Those are pretty emo. A lot of old Batman comics when he'd be fighting with like his Robins. Those are emo. So yeah, I think
we're fighting with himself.
Yeah.
I am the knight.
Yeah. Batman's a very psychologically deep, rich character, which is through the art and the writing through all these different old like 70s, 80s, 90s writers. So yeah, that's very interesting. I do say that I think that one of the reasons comic books, superhero comics, are so popular is because they were kind of action soap operas, in my opinion. I'm sure you could say more to it than that. But I think that's basically what it is. They were action soap operas with good art and They could introduce people to worlds. They were action soap operas that took place in environments that we in our regular world could never be a part of. So I think that was part of it too. Like, with all of these big, grand, epic situations and stuff. And so I think those elements are why comic books and those characters became so popular. Comic books, superhero comics, aren't really as popular today as they used to be, but that is spilled over into so many other mediums now where there's fans of these characters who probably never even read a comic book, but they know about them through the TV shows, the movies, the video games, animation, and all of that came from, the action soap opera, sci-fi source material. So I guess that's why I like comic books, and that's probably why you guys liked them too when you were kids, and it kept up with you as you aged, the same way as it's going with me. But that's very interesting. The dynamic of comics versus prose is whatever.
They don't have to be opposed. See?
Oh yeah, I know.
I don't want you to think that I say that they're opposed. The reason I mentioned the layering is because I remember when I was a child, I read Superman as a kid. So Kurt Swan.
Oh, I love Superman. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody remember Kurt Swan Superman. Kurt Swan Superman was big, barrel-chested guy, and whenever he flew, he was always flying like this. And come on now, if you've ever read any of that, you recognize Kurt Swan Superman.
Yeah, and you love it. You eat it right up.
It's campy. It's goofy. We called him Rainbow Ray Superman, the guy that shot Rainbow Ray. Yeah, you remember that, Rainbow Ray Superman. He shot rainbow rays from his hands. There's also miniature Superman, where he shoots miniature Superman from his fingers. I don't know if you ever saw that story, but it was ridiculous. Oh yes, there's a story where Superman loses his powers, and the only thing he can do is project little versions of himself that go off and do super things, while Superman Kal-El stays at home. His little miniature cells go off and fight crime.
That's pretty much a story you could only tell in a comic book medium, right? It'd be hard to do in prose.
Exactly. And that was the thing that made comics interesting. The fantastic realms, the impossible situations, the ridiculous inabilities of the characters. I mean, Lois Lane, she works with Superman day after day after day, and never notices that Clark Kent and Superman are the same guy. Under no circumstance would this work except in comics until we see 1978 Superman. Mm-hmm. And what we see is Christopher Reeves brilliantly able to punch himself down, put on his glasses, and fumble his way across a room in a way that makes you go, there's no way I could equate that guy with super suave, ultra handsome, debonair, classy, super powered Kal-El. There's no connection there.
And we get to watch the transition where he puts on the glasses and it's
That's
like,
right. You watch him do it and you're like, okay, Lois isn't an idiot. This could happen. Wait, and then the part that's even funnier is Henry Cavill said he put on a pair of glasses, walked through downtown New York, and nobody noticed him. Nobody recognized him. He said sometimes it's not that you're looking for a thing, it's that you could be standing right in front of it. If you're not thinking about it, it just doesn't occur to you. And that's what he believes happens to those characters. They can't perceive, their preconceived bias keeps them from being able to make the connection. And that conversation for all of us is real. Preconceived bias may make it so that we don't see these things. This is why storytelling matters, because the goal of good stories is to help you see you have a preconceived bias, and that when you have a preconceived bias, you end up making mistakes that change your life in a way that is not good. That's what stories were supposed to teach us. They're supposed to teach us how to survive, so that when we're living and when we're doing stuff, you learn, hey, give people a chance. You don't know them. Maybe they'll be interesting rather than being a threat. But we're innately inclined to be xenophobic and say, I don't need anything new. I got this little tribe right here. We're good. But maybe this story might convince you that stretching out is good, but it also teaches you that some stories where you meet other people might not be good, so you might want to keep your hand a little close. So all of these stories were cautionary tales designed to keep us psychologically balanced, aware, learning, open to new opportunities, and all stories, narrative or otherwise, that's their mission. So we watch comics as a kid for the adventure. And later, when you go back and you start reading them, what you find is that there's messages and meanings and themes and plots and ideas that can become part of who you are, even if you don't like the people who are distributing that message. Because there are very many, back in the day, there were a lot of people who were not really pro-black, for example. That's why there are very few black effective superheroes.
Oh.
But I liked heroes, and it was the heroic part I liked, and I tried to just ignore the racism. And like I said, for a while, and comics and I fell out over that. But I decided that I got more from comics than I lost, and I turned what I didn't like about comics into my own writing, and that's how I work through that particular challenge. So I'm not saying that they are comics, narrative storytelling, and prose are diametrically opposed. I'm saying they're layered and can have connections that change over the years. The older you get, the more varied your mental stack gets. The way you interpret stories becomes more nuanced, and I think better. I think that the older you get, the better your chances of being able to get something. Even good ideas can come from bad people.
Oh yeah, yeah. People are three-dimensional, definitely.
Right.
There are bad people who do good things and good people who do bad things. Yeah, no, that's definitely true. Cliff, you brought up something earlier that I think was interesting, and I'm just curious. You brought up the fact in your intro that somewhere along the way came the idea that, stories, with pictures in them were seen as like, unsophisticated or for kids or whatever, but it didn't always used to be like that.
Right.
Does anyone know where that came from or why that happened? If it wasn't like that in the beginning, why did that evolve to be that mindset over time, at least in Western cultures? I know that in, like Japan and Asian countries, manga's big. I don't think there's any kind of like that mindset over there.
Oh yeah. Well, okay, so there's a lot to unpack. I would say it's a 20th century thing, and without knowing, I'm not an expert in the cultural history of this point, but my suspicion is that and this is a hypothesis that would have to be supported by evidence at some future date. My hypothesis is that around the time that academia was starting to take fiction, the novel, seriously as an art form, was when that came in. Because originally, like people like Charles Dickens, they were writing the equivalent of television soap operas, right? And they were writing in he and his contemporaries, which include a little bit later H.G. Wells, a little earlier Jules Verne. They were writing for an audience that there wasn't as 100% literacy or even close at that time in the 19th century. And so there were paying gigs available for literate people to read to a group of people. So the latest issue of the Strand or whatever magazine would have the next chapter of the novel, serial novel, like say by Dickens. A group of a half dozen friends, family, whatever, would get together, buy a copy of the magazine, hand it to this person to read, and the reader would get paid and would read it out loud to them, right? And presumably show them the pictures, right? So that was not considered high art. That was considered, and then of course in the Old West in the United States at that time, in the late 19th century, there were dime novels, right? The British equivalent was a penny dreadful. And they were just churned out, right? There are a few examples of the art form that surpassed the medium, but it was not the best prose in the English language. Meanwhile, the novel, there were other threads, and the novel became more respected. That part I just narrated, that's pretty solid, what I know. But the part that's for me is speculative, is I'm thinking that at the time that the novel became more ascendant in esteem as an art form, would be the time when those illustrations started to fade, but not entirely, right? And the illustrated things that I read as a kid were like Edgar Rice Burroughs would have chapter illustrations and things like that. Not the hoity-toity stuff, right? Like Burroughs would have it, but like Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, no illustrations, right? And I think there's a spectrum, but from the reader's point of view, I'd say there's a spectrum from the illustrated children's book, like a Dr. Seuss, especially and comics, which is illustrated on every page, all the way to like some chapter titles, some color plates in the book, to just cover art. Even cover art. Like, how many times as a kid did you read a book and you're like in the middle of the book and you get to the scene in the cover, right? And you go back, you put in a bookmark, and you stare at the cover for a while. And, Thaddeus, you were talking about racism. There were a couple of books where the black character was white on the cover, right? That's Octavia Butler's novel.
Really?
Dawn. Yeah, literally. The original cover for Dawn had a scene of the protagonist waking another alien abductee, and she's a black woman, and on the cover of the book she's a white woman. There was
more than just editorial oversight, like someone
oh god no, that was deliberate. There was this idea that you could be a science fiction writer or you could be a black writer, but you couldn't be both at the same time, right?
That hasn't changed. What are you talking about? I still contend with that on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah,
really.
Well, there's with Octavia. Yeah, right. It's not as bad as it was when Octavia was starting out. Like later, her books got, and I'll use this term very specifically, her books got reskinned as African American literature, but then they couldn't look like science fiction. Right. And now the current editions are kind of a combo, finally, like what they should have been the whole time, which is black writer doing science fiction. Because no contradiction for the majority of readers, right? But the publishing industry was like, no, they're separate audiences, black readers and science fiction readers, right? And that was absolutely the thinking at the time. But I would look at the cover and see what liberties the artist had taken, but also channel my imagination, as to what it is. And of course, it's the cover that often gets us to pick up the book in the bookstore anyway, or now the thumbnail to click on, right?
Well, they were just appealing to the bias of the culture at the time. I mean,
yes.
Let us keep it real. That's what it was about, and that really, the printing industry as a whole has only really started to evolve significantly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in the last 25 years, where they've started acknowledging we can sell books to black people. We can sell books who were written by black people. We may even be able to just sell books to people. What a concept. I mean, and that's been the struggle. But even as the industry evolves, the readers haven't, because again, I can go to a convention and the first question they say to me is, well, you're an Afrofuturist. I'm like, no, not necessarily. I am a science fiction. I'm a speculative fiction writer, which means today I might write Afrofuturistic stuff. Tomorrow I might just be blowing up planets for fun and profit. You never know. I mean, and I feel like,
and that's fine.
It should be fine for me to be able to do that, and it shouldn't be a sin that if I want to do something other than Afrofuturism, it's not like, oh my God, let's clutch our pearls, and he's daring to tread upon the sacred ground of Robert Heinlein. Yes, I am. I will tread upon it with glee and abandon and not blink, because if he can do it, I can do it. Come on now.
So back in the 80s, when I was first reading, cyberpunk paperbacks, Stephen Barnes' Street Legal was significant, because not only did it have a black protagonist, it had a black protagonist on the cover, right? That was a big jump from Octavia in the 70s to Steve Barnes in the 80s. And again, that helped me visualize the character, because they had this cool guy with sunglasses and a nice jacket, and he's got this cyberpunk background, and I'm like, I want to read about that guy.
Yeah, but that's the second cover.
Yeah,
first cover wasn't so forward thinking.
Oh, it wasn't? That's the one I saw.
When you're bored, try and hunt down that first cover.
Oh,
that's all I'm gonna say. That's it. That's all I'm gonna say.
Okay. I had the paperback that, like, when the sequel started coming out, that matched.
You had the second cover.
Ooh, yeah. Well, like I said, that happened to Dawn too, right? Like, I have the first paperback edition signed by Octavia. So I mean, how many of those did she have to sign in her life, right? Like, oh my god.
Yeah, I know that had to be galling, and it's a challenge. I have a question for you though, Hilton. So I noticed you started, when I go to your Instagram, because yes, I investigate everybody. I'm the answer man. That's what I.
You research, yes.
So I went to your Instagram and I saw you had a whole bunch of diagrams. You're practicing your facing, your skinning, your structure, your body shapes. How long have you been doing that? Because I know I did this a long time ago when I was first starting to do comics and get interested in comics and decided, that's not gonna be me. I'm gonna write stories. I'm gonna let other people draw them. So I saw that you've been doing that and your stuff is good. So how long have you been doing that?
How long have I been drawing?
Yeah.
I've been drawing for maybe now a little over 2 years, but I didn't start doing people. I started just doodling. I just spontaneously decided to start drawing, and I just would just copy what I would see. And I felt it'd be easier and simpler to start with like simpler stuff. Well, simpler in terms of more cartoony. I started just copying what I would see in like, kawaii kinds of books, kind of the really cutesy like Hello Kitty style where it's just, you draw the circles and the animals. And I did that for a while and there was no real like set plan. I was just doing it. And then after a while, I started to become a bit more structured about it. So I started taking courses and reading books and watching how-to YouTube videos. And I started drawing animals and insects in more realistic ways. And I've started to like move more into people. And there's a lot that I draw that I don't post on Instagram. One, because I'm not sure it's good enough, but it's like, you can't post everything because there's just too much. But I also kind of daily, I sketch out gestures of the human body in motion because I'm trying to prepare myself to move up to drawing, action figures in more sophisticated ways, but I don't know that I'm there yet. But you also got to know how to draw people's faces. So I'm starting to draw faces. So it's been a little over 2 years now. And I kind of like learn everywhere I can. I've taken some online courses. I've read books. I've watched YouTube videos. I'm actually starting a class on Tuesday called Drawing Animals by Sori Kim, and she's really good. I've started drawing some stuff for that now to submit as assignments because I want to be really good at drawing animals and people and fantasy creatures. I'd really love to draw like not just comics, maybe my own comics or others, but also I really like what you see on like the covers of like fantasy and sci-fi novels, the person with the sword or the creature, and also what you see in like D&D or like magic cards. And I just loved like the visual, just how beautiful and epic all that could be, and where it takes your mind. I love that. So maybe someday, but for now, I'm still just a student.
I've been watching Hilton get exponentially better over the last couple of years. So that's pretty cool. He's just doing the daily thing, and what do you know? You get better with practice.
Yep.
I will say, per earlier point, I found the covers. This is the edition I have.
Yeah, that's the good cover.
Right,
Yeah.
where look how cool this protagonist
he looks
is, right?
great.
And then I found, oh my God, I found the one that Thaddeus was
Yes,
describing.
that one. Yes. That's the one I was talking about. So
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God, that is so not the character.
that is not Aubrey. That is not Aubrey, not at all. And now you understand what I was talking about.
Yeah,
Wasn't
he
just
got the
making it.
Octavia treatment with that.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's hideous. That is so awful. But
Yes, it's in the memory palace somewhere, and I keep it under lock and key, so I don't remember it. I only remember it when I have to. They're like, "Oh, remember that? No, don't make me look. Don't make me look."
it's like a white Enter the Dragon.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's not what the book is, right? It's not. It's not that. And even the background doesn't look at all. So I think he probably sold more copies with the good cover, right?
Probably.
Because it was a better illustration of what was in the book. So just the other day, I was talking to some parents that I know from Baycon, and they have a toddler. And one of them was reading Green Eggs and Ham to the toddler for the first time. And I got to watch them doing this. This was, I had my kids at GalaxyCon, and we were in like the family zone. And so I was sitting there watching my kids playing and also watching them read to theirs. And I remembered that one of the absolute genius move of Green Eggs and Ham from a storytelling perspective is like, okay, so we have Sam I Am trying to convince the unnamed other person to try this new food. And he's got the rhyming and the pictures on every page. And then he's like, try them, you will see. And he finally goes, okay, Sam, I will try them. Right. And then you turn the page and there's a double spread illustration with no words. And that page where he's holding up the kind of dripping wet green egg on a fork and looking at it, and everyone is watching him attentively and smiling in anticipation, that's the climax of the book. Right? And just to think about what a genius children's book writer Ted Geisel was, because he dared to make the climax of the book a double page illustration with no words. And just like the parent reading it would have to just hold it up and the kid would look at it as long as they wanted to look at it and get the ending, the climax of the novel. Right?
I love that, because that is a great way, if you're telling a story, ironically, for a story that is built on poems, built on a challenge, built on an emotional connection. I have an emotional object. I want you to interact with that object. You are absolutely never going to interact with that object. And you tell us, no matter where we serve it, you're not going to mess with it. To eventually get to the point where he's worn him down. He's exhausted. Fine. I'll eat it. But to say nothing in that moment was perfect, because it was exactly what needed to be, because you've been building this and building this and building this and building this. And then you get to that moment, you're expecting some long, drawn-out conversation, and instead it's a moment, just the first time in the book where nobody's saying anything.
And it lasts as long as you hold that page open.
It's masterful. That is the essence of comics: pacing, timing, spacing, how you move through the story, the linguistic conversation that the story offers you, the emotional connections. The medium of comics is it's brilliant. I know comics aren't like a lot of medium where we get thousands of hours of documentaries about how we make films and why we make films and what we make films on and why books are written. Comics just don't get that. They should. There's a book by Scott McCloud,
Understanding Comics.
There you go. If you read Scott McCloud's book, all that you need to know about comics takes place in this book. Because what he does is he doesn't talk about comics as in Marvel or DC or manga. He talks about narrative storytelling juxtaposed through time in adjacent frames, and allowing those frames to carry story in a way that you don't even recognize as being done, because each art style carries with it certain kinds of information. If you want to do comics, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics is literally, and it's old, 1993, I think, somewhere thereabout. It was one of the finest treatments I think I've ever read on why we make comics, or why we could make comics, why we should make comics, and that it is not a child's medium. In the hands of a master storyteller, it is magnificent, and you can tell amazing stories. And we have seen it. You know, if you've read anything done right in comic format, there are some stories that literally can't be touched. And even when they try to remake them in animations and movies, you're like, no.
Like Watchmen.
Emotional. Yes, like Watchmen. Right. Watchmen in the comic format is unmatched.
I read Watchmen. Watchmen was great.
It's peerless. And when they tried to make it as a movie,
they did their best, but
it's
not the right medium for that story. You know,
you don't agree, Hilton?
No, I don't disagree with you. I just don't remember Watchmen that well. I remember seeing it. I watched it a long time ago. I didn't think it was. I mean, I'm remembering.
It was okay.
Yeah, I didn't think it was bad. I just don't remember it. I know that.
Right. And that's the point. Is that it isn't bad.
I remember that the climax of the movie with the in the comic, there's like this big, like, you know, monster
alien thing
that was like, I think, not in the movie, and I was kind of like, that was a huge that was such a huge element of the comic book and of the story for you to not put that in the movie. I guess
That's why the comedian gets murdered in the beginning.
Right.
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 You know?
I guess they didn't have the budget for it.
No, that was a stylistic
the ending.
choice. They changed it. They just changed it. They chose not to trust the medium. They didn't trust the comic.
Yeah.
They didn't trust what the comic had to say, and they felt they could change it, and they could. But then it isn't The Watchmen. It's something else.
Yeah. So
I remember that being a part of that movie that I took issue with. But I was like, I don't remember like anything else except what people looked like, except for the fact that the ending was not what it should have been, or the ending climax. Everything else about that movie is kind of just imagery and actors doing stuff.
It was style.
That's about right. That's a really good film review.
It's style.
Right there.
It's style, but no substance. The substance of Watchmen in the comic is different. The way they try to, I call it medium transference failure. When you take one medium, you try to transfer it to another. Sometimes, because of the way comics tell stories, you can't transfer them into movies as easily. If you look at any story that comics have tried to translate, that the movies have tried to translate from comics, generally they just fall flat. They don't mean to fall flat. They have to change the characters in a way that lets the medium film address its issues with the fact that films are very slow comics. They're frames, but they're very slow comics. And you can do things in comics you can't do or don't do in film. And I think that hurts comics when you try to transfer them to film, because you have to try and fill the space between the frames with stuff. And the other thing is, you don't get any of the internal world of the characters. Because comics, at least in the old days, I notice in the new days, we don't get to see much of their internal world anymore. Now, everybody has dialogue. And that drives me crazy, because we never know how they feel. We only know what they say.
Yeah, I missed the thought bubbles. Remember the thought bubbles?
They don't have them anymore, right?
They don't do those anymore. They're trying to. I think I read somewhere they're trying to write comics now where, similar to how you might do TV or movies, where in a TV or a movie you can't do like a thought bubble, whatever. You have to show it with, action, or what maybe like with action. And so they're trying to like transfer that thinking to comics to show like through the action and situations how people are feeling. But they kind of will do it anyway with like the captions. Like they won't have a thought bubble, but there will be captions just saying what the character's thinking, which is basically just like a thought bubble, except it's in the caption.
Yeah, but it's you know what? It's different though. I'm going to give you something. One of the things that annoys me about modern film is that modern film says that the only motivations are the ones you see on the screen. If it doesn't show up on the screen, it didn't happen. You don't get to, if an actor can't demonstrate a particular appearance or a fear or a trepidation, the only way you're going to know it is if they say it. Comics used to let us have, Peter Parker used to be able to be insecure, and he might actually think about that insecurity for a moment. He might make a decision in his mind, and we might get to see it and ruminate with it. Today, we don't know what our characters are thinking, and unless they tell us, we will never know. And I find that to be one of the great losses of comics, because now every superhero is always sure. They're always perfect. They're always knowing what they're doing, and they're always going to be right, even when they're wrong. See Civil War. If you haven't seen the comic, see it. That's a perfect example of the heroes are always right, even when they're not, and they make decisions that are right, even when they're not. But we never get to see their motivations, how they think about it. Just do it. And I find that's a loss for comics. Yeah, they throw it up in the caption from time to time, but that little blurb there means that somebody wanted to say more and wasn't allowed to. And that was the concession. That little caption that might show up in the corner in the dialogue box. Those dialogue boxes that you're talking about, the caption boxes, they used to be story bridges. They used to say, here's something that's about to happen. Now we're going to go over here and talk about this. And they used to talk to us. They used to break the fourth wall and talk to us as the reader. They don't do that anymore. Now we get Deadpool to do that. And God, I can't stand that guy. Anyway, that's my point.
Just wanted to raise up. We had a question in the chat from Andrew Lucas. I think that's for you, Thaddeus. As a sequential art writer, do you use beat sheets? That's a question from one of our viewers.
You're supposed to. So here you go. Here's what I end up doing. If I want to turn a comic into, if I want to write a story to do anything else with it, I got to write the story. So I write a story. When I'm done writing a story, I will then get someone to help me convert it into other stuff, because I like to know what's going to happen from the beginning, middle, and end. And then I like to be able to say, this is a climax. This is important. This here. This part is important here. This is important here, and why each one of those is important. And then this climax is important here, and I want to make sure we talk about that. So I've told my story. I got my story arc. It's in, it's up, it's down, it's where I needed to be, denouement. I have to have that before I turn it into something else. Now, I know there are plenty of writers who do comics who don't do that. They just, I got a story, I'm going to blast it out. Boom, we are done. I need a story. Before I'm going to convert it, I don't want medium transfer loss. I don't want it to go, well, I wrote a prose story and it's weak when I transfer it to the new medium. I want to write a strong prose story. I want a story there that feels good, that feels deep, and that if there was not a single picture, you still could understand what was happening. Then what I do is I go back and I delete what I don't need to let the artist tell the story that I can't tell, because that part of the story gets removed. Because it is. You're removing the narrative, the descriptive part of your story, so that you only have dialogue. So if you look at a story and it's only dialogue, that means you've gotten rid of everything else. That means your artist has to provide that. They've got to provide the mood. They've got to provide the lighting. You know, in that critical moment when the villain's stroking his cat and the light falls from behind him and all you see is his glittering eyes, you need that artist to give you that. And you used to talk about that in your narrative, but you can't now because you don't have the space for that. So the artist must bring that, and you have to rely on that. So having a beat sheet is great. I got to have a story first. I got to break my story into pieces, and then I got to sit down with the artist and say, hey, since I don't have this really important stuff, I need you to make sure that these critical scenes don't get overlooked. I don't want the moment when the hero's about to succumb, but then changes his mind and says, I'm going to fight no matter what. I want that to be right. Remember Spider-Man when he's standing under that building and they're holding him down and he's saying, I can't do this, I can't do this. And then he stands up and he's holding that whole building above him. If you've never seen that clip, go find it. It's an extraordinary shot. That shot was captured perfectly by the artist, and it probably would have been lost if the writer hadn't said what they wanted when they wrote it. It's important to be able to have a beat sheet, but it's more important to have a story. I am a writer. I want a story first. I don't care how pretty the pictures are. If there's no story there, please don't waste my time.
Yeah, and I think that I see that a lot, where people fall in love with the visuals and don't tell a story. You see that in film, you see that in comics, you see that in TV. The story is the story, right? Like you spend millions on George Clooney being in your movie, and millions on set design, and millions on special effects, and you pay some writer to write something, and it's like, that should not be the afterthought. That's like building a palace on a foundation of sand.
Yeah.
And you need to build it on a solid foundation.
It hurts all movies and all films when there's no bat nipples. We know. That's what they made power sanders for, brother. That's what they made power sanders.
Yeah.
If you've got this, they spend millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and there's no story there. Rebel Moon, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't seen Rebel Moon, but I've heard of.
You haven't seen it?
I've heard the discourse about it, but no, I haven't seen it. But
don't see how easy that was. I can save you from yourself. Don't. Yes, I know there are plenty of fans out there going, "Oh, Rebel Moon is the best." No, poor man Star Wars is not it. Star Wars is barely it, but poor man Star Wars is worse. Don't do it. Just
instead, see if you want Seven Samurai in space, see the Roger Corman Battle Beyond the Stars. It is cheesy fun.
But there's just better stuff out there. If you just want to watch TV, For All Mankind, magnificent, just wonderful, wonderful stuff.
I'm a big fan of Babylon 5.
The Expanse,
because it has an arc. It started with the story. That's he wrote the story first, beginning, middle, and end.
How many seasons was Babylon?
5. Planned 5, filmed 5.
There you go. So
Yeah.
it's important. It's important to have story. I feel like the industries as a whole, no matter where the industry is, story is getting forgotten. It is an afterthought. Writers are paid the least of anybody. It's like, okay, we're going to make a film. We spend millions everywhere else, and we'll throw a couple of $1,000 at a writer or a writing team. And unfortunately, and I'm going to say this, and I will probably regret it, I find collaborative writing problematic because the concept of yes and is nice, because that's what collaborative write. If you write in a writing room, one of the things they tell you is you don't say no to an idea, you say yes and there's nothing wrong with that. But I find that when I look at stories that have been collaboratively written, and you see 25 writers in a writing room, you're like,
yeah. That's like, okay, I'm going to differentiate here between writing by committee, which you've just described, and like, say, a prose writing team, like Fred Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth. And Fred, at various conventions, described his unique writing method with Cyril Kornbluth, and it was technology dependent. It required typewriters. So when they decided, when Kornbluth and Pohl decided to write a book, they would go to one of their houses, and they would sit in the living room and drink and talk about what the book was going to be.
right.
And then they would flip a coin, and whoever lost would go upstairs to the typewriter and type 4 pages and end at 4 pages, mid-sentence, mid-word, whatever, and then come downstairs, and then the other guy would go up and write the next 4 pages. And they would do this until they had a first draft, then they would tidy it up and then send it off. And Fred said that he didn't remember on the collaborations who had written what pages now, you know.
There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's actually quite clever. A friend of mine and I, we do that right now. We have a story, Desperately Seeking Cerberus. I write a chapter, he writes a chapter. We don't talk about the story. We have never talked about it. We just write. So I'll write a chapter, he writes a chapter. I will look at his chapter, riff off his chapter, or not, depending on what I want. And sometimes we'll find that the story will diverge for a minute, then it'll come back together, then it'll diverge again. It has been a blast because we're not talking, we are focused on telling a good story in each chapter. Each chapter is a story, and then it's connected to the other chapters. So the story is the primary element, and we enjoy doing that. I think it's fun as we're working, as someone wrote here, says, in anthologies or RPGs, collaboration is great because you're not based in time. When you're looking at films, there's a timing limitation. You have to get that done in a certain amount of time, and you have to squeeze everything into that time. So RPGs work great because you don't have to worry about time. You can make it as big or as small as you want, cut out what you need, and still make it work. Collaboration can work well there. I just find that when we're looking at stories, and telling a collaborative story is a challenge because I have to trust that other guy. I have to trust that he's not going to, pardon my French, shit on my work. And he does. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant writer. And what I find myself doing is, can I live up to what H. Wolfgang Porter has just laid down? He drops the gauntlet. I have to pick it up, and he is brilliant. I want to be there when he's there. So yeah, story matters, and I think that's why comics work. I think that's why they'll always work. The comics and manga will probably, no matter how overpriced they become, they're going to always work because the story matters. And if you can figure out the right story, get the right kernel and the right artist behind it, it sells and people love it and they will talk about it.
And I'm going to bring it home by just saying that kind of collaboration can be between a writer and an illustrator.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And where they work together, not necessarily from the beginning. Maybe you get assigned an illustrator, but you respect each other's work and let the other person do what they're good at.
Yes.
And the end result, the comic book or illustrated story, can transcend either the prose or the illustrations.
Yes.
All right. Bob is here, so I'm going to ask for final comments. Hilton, you haven't been talking the last few minutes, so give us some final comments, thoughts about visual medium. By the way, I want to shout out to your Bat Van Gogh shirt that you've got on there.
Yes, yep. I like that. When I first saw that, I was like, I didn't wear my Superman shirt today. Now
I was expecting you to wear your Superman shirt.
Normally I do, but it's hot here. And I love that shirt, but it is a winter shirt. It is not a summer shirt.
Okay,
It would
fair.
be baking me. But I got Batman.
We'll have you back in the winter. Oh,
Yeah,
bat chair.
I got Batman in
Oh,
the chair.
yeah.
It's so good.
The bat chair. To the bat chair, Robin.
That's right.
Batman
so
hits
good.
middle age, gets the bat recliner.
Before you guys wrap up,
Yes.
sometimes I'm like that little kid sitting at the picture window whose grandma won't let him go out and play, and he sees these kids out in the street having fun. That's like watching a podcast from the booth. You guys are doing wonderful. But I talked very briefly with Hilton before the show about this story. You talked about story and all of the special effects and graphics in the world don't replace story. Okay. I have just watched the first season of J.J. Abrams' Caped Crusader. Okay. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, and I don't know what you think of it, but I know this. The animation is not the reason to watch this. The stories, the way they tell them, and how they tell them, and that they tell the stories first. And the Batman is a character in a real world filled with interesting people, more of a catalyst than the center stage is just phenomenal. So I don't know. Have any of you guys seen it enough to have an opinion and tell me why I'm so wrong?
You're not wrong. I have. I've watched it. You're not wrong. It is good. It's like Batman's animated adventures if an adult were taking their time and telling a slightly slower paced story. There's not that feeling of being like Batman the Animated Adventures had a formula and they rushed through many of them. I mean, they tried and sometimes they were successful, but I feel like they rushed a lot of those stories. In this new Caped Crusader, it feels slower, richer, more subtle. There's a comfort. They don't feel like they're rushing. They don't feel like they're trying to fill a 20-minute window. They're telling a story and they're going to take their time and they're going to make it good to look at and interesting to follow. And if you've watched the animated Batman's Animated Adventure, the very first ones, and you see this, you'll feel there is an emotional connection being written into them. This is an Elseworld Batman. He is 1940s-esque Batman. They've changed some of the characters, so it's not the Bat world but it's still a Batman you can connect to, and I think they did a great job. Now, Hilton was closing, so go ahead and close, Hilton, before we forget again.
Oh, I was just saying, if you're someone a lot of people, when they're learning about comics, one of the big questions they have is, how do I start? What do I do? To start for doing this character or whatever? And I say, just start wherever you want. Just like, you just got to jump in and start reading. Don't wait for a particular graphic novel collection or a certain story to figure it out. Just jump in. Either get a back issue or start with a current issue and just start. You'll figure it out as you go. So just start reading wherever you want to pick it up at and go from there.
Excellent point. All right, so I would like to thank Bob for hosting. I would like to thank my wonderful guests, Hilton Collins and Thaddeus Howze. I would like to thank the in-studio audience and anyone watching this in the future, perhaps an anthropologist discussing writing a discourse on the early 21st century. Might I suggest to those future anthropologists that in your dissertation, a few illustrations might help. You could include sketches of Hilton and Thaddeus in your having an interaction, and Batman. Why not? I will say, because the pre-order link doesn't work, I do have a story in 2 Hour Transport 2 coming out very soon from Fairwood Press. It is a reprint, so for those of you who have When the Hero Comes Home 2 or have listened to it on Escape Pod. It's a reprint, but it's in with some really cool stories, including one of my writing teachers, Karen Joy Fowler. So that's exciting to be in a book with one of your teachers. And it is one of my favorite stories. So Alien Invasion one. I'm also going to put a plug in for my coffee mug. My friend Lon Lopez does figure action movies on YouTube, and it's like a Robot Chicken kind of thing where they build the sets and they move.
Yeah.
But it's less for comedic and more like general, like gritty storytelling. So it's interesting. And he did a presentation at GalaxyCon yesterday that I caught, and I won the trivia contest. So I got the mug. So yeah. Anyway, that's it for me. Bob, take it away. Close it.
Hey, this is fun. I have never felt more peripheral in my life than your two guests. You guys, anytime, when Cliff has his fatal heart attack or stroke or whatever he has, you guys, I'll just keep you dialed in. Because
good to know.
Please don't kill Cliff.
Well, he's not a character in any of my stories, but
and I feel very happy about that.
Hey, I bought a bunch of little plastic black and white skulls so that I can keep track of how many characters I killed in a work in progress.
Wow.
You're
going to need some more skulls, Bob.
I actually had to buy a second pack. I don't mind killing characters. I mean, ever since George R.R. Martin, I cannot call him George R.R. Martin on a podcast because he actually knows my name because we both have a good suspender collection, and that's the only thing we ever talk about when we meet is suspenders and Cheetos. But
I talked to David Hartwell about ties because we both have silly ties. He did. His
willingness to. I had not read the books when I saw the Red Weddings episode. And it was like, but I like, it was just one of them moments. So
you were tired of paying the actors, so let's reduce the cast.
So anyway, back where we're at next week, I'm telling you guys, it is David Gerald. It's coming on with Adam Troy Castro for the last month. And so I appreciate another thing out of you guys. Y'all let me test the new system so I didn't have to test it on them.
I'm sure that David Gerald and Adam Troy Castro appreciate that as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, and speaking of David Gerald and Jim Wright and Cliff Winnig, all three of them, along with Adam Troy Castro and Alan Dean Shapiro and K.G. Anderson, are appearing in Southern Edition or Southern Truths.
I still like the Bless Their Hearts subtitle. You should keep that.
Yeah, that was how we started it, but it just turned into Southern Truths. God, I could wax being... y'all notice I have a slightly a twinge of a Southern accent. To see a lot of people's different perspectives of the South. Now, who here is from the South?
My family's from the South.
Oh, where at, Thaddeus?
Mobile, Alabama.
Oh my goodness, the deep South. I spent most of my most of my formative years in Memphis, Tennessee. And so my story in Southern Truths is set in a future Memphis, Tennessee.
Yeah. It is funny how I was working on a piece for this, and I said, anybody who says they can describe the South is a liar. because the concept is the South is so many things to so many people. I had one guy tried to write the story of the South, and he got a nice note back that talked about the depredations of the Southerners' cultural heritage by taking down statues. Um, I corrected him. But now this is from a guy whose name I have to admit. My name's Robert Lee. I was named after my grandpa, who was named after the general, and that was how it was explained to me. I'm not giving my name back, but I'm not gonna pretend that it wasn't the Slavers' Rebellion and he was one of the leaders. But anyway, back on the South thing, it's coming out, and it also has Adam. Did I say Adam Troy Castro?
You did.
We have got just a hell of a lineup in this, and I've got all the stories assembled. Meeting with Karen right after this, and we're going to look at the cover. You know, Karen has got her opinions on covers, and she's my co-editor, and she's a hell of an editor. So
she's smart. Do whatever she says.
You know, that's a good place to start. Not always the best place to finish, but it's a great place to start. Like listening to these guys talk about collaborations. I've collaborated through novels with people, a couple of them, and you got to listen to what the people got to say. Unless you're Thaddeus, you don't listen, you don't say, you just write.
No, he listens.
I listen. I just feel like when we're collaborating, the song is we're doing something like jazz. That's what we're doing. We're doing storytelling jazz. I don't tell him what to write. I tell him how to feel, and that's the only thing we talk about is we're trying to keep a particular feeling.
So you have a series of solos.
That's right.
What you said actually resonated with me a lot, having been through the collaborative process on multiple occasions. It is truly sometimes the conversation can get in the way of the creation.
Yep.
So anyway, but we're not doing a collaborative. I just want to say thank you. And that is an interesting T-shirt there, Hilton.
Thank you.
You know, I love it. I had on my pink Bigfoot T-shirt when I started, but I had to go get a real shirt on because there are expectations, you know, about how we do this.
Well, you're a big publisher, so you have to, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Look like you belong in a New York City boardroom, right?
Oh, yeah. I'll be right over there, New York City.
New York City. Anyway.
Andrew Lucas says BQ Press needs to publish comics. You know, I love comics. I grew up with some of my, I could get comic books, but I wasn't allowed to check out science fiction books from the library. So I had to, my family was opposed. They were the mean evangelicals. You know, there's the Christians who, hey, everybody's good. We all love each other. And then there's evangelicals that are looking for some reason to be pissed off.
Dude, I grew up in the South in the Satanic Panic.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You probably cast satanic blessings on your dice before you threw them or whatever. Yeah.
Duh.
Doesn't everyone?
Right. Yeah, like, how do you think you're going to get a natural 20? Come on. It's an unnatural 20. Anyway.
You know, I'm going to say one thing about D&D. When I was in a hospital one time and the woman leaned over and the doctor tried to reassure me that there was only a 1% chance I would die as a result of this procedure. And I thought about all the times in my life I had thrown double aughts.
Yeah.
And said,
it happens.
Could you reassure me better?
There was a comic strip, and I think it was actually written by an evangelical, but called Croc, about the French Foreign Legion. And there was a running gag of a guy on a stretcher with a cannonball in his chest going to the doctor. And there was one, I think it was a Sunday comic, and again, visual medium, right? So Sunday comic where the guy comes in with the giant cannonball in his chest, and the doctor's going to do the surgery, and the doctor says, "Don't worry, the odds of dying during this procedure are 1 in 10,000, and I've never lost a patient yet." And the guy says, "How many times have you done the procedure?" And he says, 9,999.
Oh, okay. Can either of you two reach through here? Yeah, just kind of smack.
Yeah. We're gonna pretend we didn't hear that. Let's
We got to get you guys out of here because I know you've got work to do, and
I do.
Based on the size of that
radio to get back to today.
Yeah, based on the size of that jug, I bet Hilton has other places to be.
He's gonna dive into that virtual pool right there.
Okay, so just remember, BQ Press next Sunday is Jim and David going to tell us about the world. We've got a new book coming out next month, probably 2 of them. Cliff is in both of them, Scott's Planet and Southern Truths. And it's
I look
exciting.
forward to seeing them.
I do too.
I will say, as a final anecdote, that one of the reasons I'm a writer is that I was a reader of comic books, and one of the comic books I read back in the day was Micronauts because I really loved the toys. I was playing with the toys, and there was great story, great art, and they wrote, actually, the alphabet of the Microverse was based on Devanagari, the Sanskrit alphabet, and that was like sprinkled throughout. So there was this visual element. But they had a letters to the editor comics, like all Marvel, and I wrote my first letter to the editor to Micronauts, and they published it in issue 35. And I got issue 35, and I looked in the letter, and they not only published my letter, they answered me. And, I was a kid and I saw my name spelled correctly in print, and I'm like, I like that.
I didn't spell
that was where it started.
Well, yeah, I know everybody has their favorite comic. I love Dead Man. I mean, there was something interesting and unique about that, and I still don't know why I loved it. But I mean, no, it's just the idea he could go into all these different bodies, and sometimes the things he tried to do with the body he had was like, oh, it don't bend that way. I understand it more. So anyway, thank you. Thank you, Hilton. Thank you, Thaddeus, and thank you, Cliff. You guys are all, God, we got to get you guys, we got to get especially you two back. You don't always agree on everything.
Isn't that nice?
You disagree so nicely.
Nothing wrong with disagreeing.
But they're nice people, so that's why, Bob.
Yeah, but it brings, when people don't have a lockstep agreement on stuff, it brings out nuances that help people understand the whole damn thing better.
Well, they're also both deep thinkers, so that helps. Like they consider things.
Well, anyway, thank you, and we are going